Good morning, and hope everyone enjoyed the brief break and got a nice chance to get some coffee. Here's the next panel, which is hopefully going to be an interesting one. Two of everyone's favorite issues. We've got competition and privacy. See if they go head-to-head, how they complement one another, the interplay between the two, and the way that both the US and the rest of the world is looking at these two issues and how they come together, and looking forward how we can address a lot of these challenges as we look towards the future of what is increasingly a more connected world. So I'm going to turn over to our speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into the discussion, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions as well.
So should I just do a brief introduction or my remarks?
Whatever you prefer.
Oh, okay.
Dealer's choice.
Great. So I'm Maureen Olhausen. I'm head of the antitrust and competition practice at Baker Botts, where I also am active in privacy and data security areas. Formerly acting chairman and commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. So I've spent a long time in my career thinking about and trying to harmonize competition and privacy law. And so a couple principles have really, I think, come forth from that in my mind as we look at these issues. So antitrust often views the joining of complementary assets as a benefit, as an efficiency, as something that will help provide better products to consumers, spur competition, all those good things. But when that asset is data, sometimes privacy concerns arise. And so there has been this question about whether antitrust should be used as some kind of tool to enhance privacy for consumers. Now, if two companies are competing on privacy and they, joining them together would reduce that competition on privacy, that's a pretty straightforward antitrust issue, just as if we had two companies that were competing on innovation or competing on other forms of product quality. But it's a more complex issue when you start to say, well, this can be a benefit to innovation and it can be an efficiency, but we have other privacy concerns about it. And so I actually have an article called Privacy and Competition, Friends, Foes, or Frenemies. And at times they're sometimes in harmony, and sometimes they're in opposition. And some of the issues involving not so much mergers, but single firm power in particularly in digital markets, some of the proposals that have been put forward about data sharing, requiring companies to share their data, really create sort of very strong tensions with a lot of privacy kinds of protections that we think about. And that's, I think, the more foes part. And then, kind of the third issue, and then I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists, is, well, what's the path forward here? What's a good way to proceed? And I'm actually a big supporter of, in the US, having a uniform federal privacy bill that, rather than trying to kind of distort a lot of the very traditional antitrust principles to address these, often very valid privacy concerns, that would be much better to just for Congress to pass a federal privacy bill that sets a level playing field and sets out what are the, the allowed uses, the obligations, and all those kinds of, consumer rights in this area. So I'll stop there, but that's sort of my overall principle, the way I look at these two topics coming together.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm George Slover. I'm with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We've been around for almost 30 years now, since the internet was just ramping up, focusing on a lot of these issues, privacy being chief among them. And competition is something that has been brought into the mix as well. That's why I was brought on board. Previously, I was at Consumer Reports, Consumers Union. Before that, I was at the House Judiciary Committee, also at the Antitrust Division, and worked on the Antitrust Modernization Commission back in the early aughts. So I've been dealing with competition policy for quite a while, not privacy so much, but I'm learning to love it and the interplay between the two. I could be very brief and just say I agree with essentially everything that Maureen said, but instead I will try to dispense with the absolutist viewpoints that more competition naturally improves privacy protections, that more competition unavoidably undermines privacy protections, and that achieving greater privacy protections requires sacrificing competition. I'm exaggerating a bit for effect, but not much. The true picture is more nuanced and more interesting and presents us with more opportunity for constructive efforts. Some antitrust advocates start from the premise that more vigorous antitrust enforcement will lead to a more open marketplace that strengthens incentives to compete on all aspects of quality, including better privacy. That's true to an extent, and privacy can play a part in antitrust enforcement decisions. Many cite Facebook and WhatsApp as a classic example. That WhatsApp made protecting user privacy a priority, which led Facebook to also make it a priority, but that after Facebook acquired WhatsApp, it became not so much of a priority, and that stopping that merger could have avoided that loss. But it is more accurate to say that more vigorous antitrust enforcement will tamp down anti-competitive incentives to refrain from improving privacy protections. For example, incentives for a group of platforms or online services to collude to avoid or delay spending resources on improving privacy, or incentives for a single platform or service to take advantage of having market power, the lack of effective competition, to avoid or delay spending those resources because they know no one can challenge them. The Facebook WhatsApp example. So competition and vigorous antitrust enforcement to protect and promote it can help create an environment where healthy market forces are free to do their work. But tamping down the anti-competitive incentives does nothing to tamp down the profit-making incentives that remain in full force even in an open, competitive marketplace. Competition can certainly foster profit-making incentives to improve privacy to the extent consumers want that enough to make choices on the basis of it. But those incentives may or may not be strong enough to overcome the profit-making incentives to exploit gaps in privacy for commercial gain, the surveillance capitalism that was referred to in the last panel. Now, some privacy experts start from the premise that the personal data being amassed poses threats to privacy, which increase as the amount of data increases, and therefore that a merger that would increase the amount of data held by a single company poses a threat that warrants using the antitrust laws to stop the merger. Accepting that the threat to privacy is very real, that does not mean it is a competition concern that can be addressed by the antitrust laws. Merger enforcement falls under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which prohibits an acquisition where the effect, quote, may be substantially to lessen competition, close quote. So the question for antitrust enforcers is not whether the increase in the amount of data will imperil consumer privacy, but whether it will substantially reduce the consumer choice that competition fosters. Those questions are not entirely unrelated, but they are quite different. And as Maureen said, it is not wise to try to stretch the antitrust laws to reach every concern with growth in size of a company. The antitrust laws and open competition are not a cure-all for everything that ails the marketplace. If we want strong privacy protections, we need a strong privacy law, like my organization has been working for many years. At the other end are some who say that competition and privacy are in inherent conflict, that efforts to strengthen antitrust law and enforcement will unavoidably compromise privacy protections, and that strengthening privacy protections will require sacrificing competition, and that we just need to accept that the market will become ever more concentrated. But we don't need to give up. Competition is not inconsistent with regulation. In fact, competition and regulation can both work best when they can work hand in hand each with an eye to the value of the other. Sure, competition and privacy can be in some tension, but they are not irreconcilable. Policymakers and businesses just need to pursue both objectives carefully, keeping both objectives in mind. A good example of the importance of keeping both objectives in mind is the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, under active consideration in Congress. The bill aims to promote competition by more clearly prohibiting large online platforms from giving preferential access and treatment to their own products and services over those of other companies that depend on having access to the platform to reach customers. That's a worthy pro-competition goal that CDT strongly supports. But the mechanics of how the bill would accomplish that by opening access to the platform could potentially compromise privacy protections that platforms have in place or are putting in place, or that we want them to put in place. The bill recognizes this risk and seeks to address it by giving the platform an affirmative defense when it proves that a restrictive action was necessary to protect user privacy. But the kinds of enforcement procedures and considerations that might be workable with traditional forms of commerce are not as workable when the platform must act quickly and with confidence to address threats to privacy and security in its system. For example, the bill permits the government to obtain an immediate injunction by making a plausible claim supported by substantial evidence that an access restriction violates the new law. The access restriction can be blocked for 120 days. It is not as clear as the bill is currently written that the usual requirements of prior notice and opportunity for a hearing would apply, that the platform would have an opportunity to make its case that the restriction is necessary to protect privacy and security before it is too late. 120 days is a very long time. We understand that the sponsors of the bill are continuing to consider further clarifications, and we hope that will include the privacy concerns we've raised. And if they don't make the changes before the bill is enacted, there is going to be an agency implementation process where they're going to figure out what the statute means, and we'll be engaged in that as well. And those efforts are already underway with the similar law in the EU, the Digital Markets Act. A few decades ago, antitrust lawyers had to start making room for economists. Some say they made too much room. Now we have to make room for technologists, and there's going to be a lot of interesting work for all of us.
Thank you. I know panels are most interesting when there's a lot of disagreement on the panel, but I generally agree with both what the commissioner said and what George said about the general principles about how competition and privacy need to fit together. So I'm Aaron Cooper. I run the global policy program at BSA, the Software Alliance. We are an association of enterprise technology companies. So it's the companies that are providing the cloud services, cyber, AI, data analytics to companies in other industries as they go through their digital transformation, the ag industry, the retail industry, the auto industry, and so on. I think it's fair to say that in our industry, there is a lot of dynamic efficiency going on. If you look at the way the technology was at the beginning of COVID versus now, you see dramatic improvements in the way platforms work, the way our communication systems work. I think that there is an important role for antitrust to play in privacy protection and in regulation of the technology industry more generally. It's not the exclusive way, but I think it's important. There's, when we think about the antitrust laws, as both the Commissioner and George said, we look at consumer welfare and are we lowering prices and increasing choices for consumers? And traditionally, we think of those just in economic terms, but of course, choices include things like, how is my data going to be used? Am I going to be able to protect it? What options do I have? And that hits the privacy realm as well. And so I think that there's an important role that antitrust plays there. It's not sufficient to rely on the antitrust rules in order to protect privacy. Whether you're if you're a small or medium-sized company, there should still be an obligation to make sure that the way you're using consumer data is consistent with what the consumer would expect. And we need to make sure that regardless of the antitrust laws, that there are the appropriate privacy rights for consumers and the appropriate obligations on companies to make sure that privacy is protected. So I think they do need to go in tandem. And as George said, with respect to CDT, we strongly support there being a federal privacy law because we need those in addition to having the competition tools there. I think that having this discussion about competition and privacy is also helpful for the entire ecosystem, because one of the things that we notice often in discussions around technology regulation generally is that they tend to be very siloed. We're either talking about privacy, or we're talking about cybersecurity, or we're talking about AI, or we're talking about antitrust. And it's important to have more interdisciplinary discussions so that when we think about what are our objectives in data governance or our objectives in making sure that tech companies and companies in other sectors that are using technology are acting responsibly, it's important to think about the whole range of different substantive areas of the law to make sure that the objectives that we're trying to get are matched with those laws. As somebody, as George was saying, he worked on House Judiciary, to work on Senate Judiciary, we think about the tools that are available within that jurisdiction. And that happens in the US and it happens in governments abroad as well. And the more we can start having these interdisciplinary conversations, I think the better tech regulation overall will be going forward. So thanks very much for having me and look forward to questions.
You know, the problem with being the fourth speaker is that everything that's insightful and intelligent has already been said. And I am in general quite in agreement with what has been expressed already. My name is Brian Nabil, and I am a research fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I mostly work on artificial intelligence, data privacy, and innovation policy issues. You know, I think it's important to think about privacy and antitrust as being part of a system that helps determine overall how well, I fear I scared her away. So, you know, I think it's important to think them as part of a system that helps determine how attractive a particular tech ecosystem is relative to its global counterparts. Now, I always used to think that the GDPR is bad. GDPR, of course, has many issues for European innovation and consumer welfare, but what it does is that it at least provides a harmonized framework for digital services in 27 EU member states. If you're a German exporter trying to sell your products in Poland or in Ireland, you don't have to abide by 27 different sets of regulation. Many American policymakers, of course, I think have rightly criticized the GDPR for a variety of its flaws. But I think we are, in this country, I think we are rapidly approaching a situation where the converse criticisms of the American data privacy framework, data privacy landscape is becoming true. Becoming evident, those criticisms. With the growing divergence between the different state laws, one can easily imagine a circumstance in which a company's data practices with respect to a data subject in Utah is perfectly fine, but not with respect to a data subject based in, say, California. If these issues are hard for policymakers in DC to keep up with, one can only imagine how hard it would be for a startup or a founder in Berlin or in London without the background in American law to really keep up with these sort of developments. And if they decide not to offer a certain product in American markets, it would of course be American consumers that would lose out from that product not being offered. Now, how does antitrust sort of interact with this system? One might think, well, surely antitrust and combining antitrust and data privacy would actually improve data privacy, but not, as some of my other panelists have pointed out, not necessarily. There is often a trade-off between antitrust and data privacy. It doesn't always happen, but one often sees it. I think Erica Douglas correctly identifies in her last year's Yale Law Journal article that in the emerging intersection between competition and privacy law, we're likely to see primacy of competition goals. And there are two reasons for that. First, antitrust regulators will, of course, prioritize competition over privacy. And second, privacy harms definition and case law remains much more underdeveloped compared to the extensive body of antitrust law. I'm not a lawyer, so I shall defer to the expertise of my fellow panelists for final matters of antitrust law. But what I think is becoming clear is that the focus of this dual approach will likely be less on privacy concerns and more on competition and more on and companies becoming targeted not for their data privacy policies, but more because of their perceived market dominance. Now, of course, there are other countries that are combining these two approaches too, but I think there are two factors in the US that make it a bit more tricky in this country. The first is the US privacy landscape compared to the EU, for example, is already rather fragmented. So that means that when you combine antitrust as well, it would further exacerbate the uncertainties that I think many startups face. And second, too, in Britain and Germany, for example, civil servants and bureaucrats normally have the mandate to uphold political neutrality. And that is much less the case for political appointees in the administrative agencies. And I think you run the risk of, when you combine these two things, that it could unnecessarily politicize the debate around privacy and detract from legitimate privacy goals as well. Now, what then is the way forward? Of course, competition and data privacy, I think both are important concerns, but they need to be treated separately. For privacy, when Congress if or when Congress passes a data privacy law, I think it's got to do two things. First, it's got to preempt state laws, and second, it's got to apply the same standards for all industries, but impose different liabilities depending on the data type. What I mean by that, you can think of a 2x2 matrix. On one hand, you've got sort of critical data and non-critical data. Critical data being sort of medical data and educational data and that sort of things. And then you've got critical services and you've got non-critical services. The definitions will vary, but critical services would be something like services like a medical operation or financial services, for example. So the strictest privacy standard then should apply to sensitive data that's used to provide a critical service, like a medical operation or banking, for example, and the least strict standard should apply to non-sensitive data for a non-critical service. I'm thinking about my Netflix or my Spotify streaming preferences and that sort of things. That's not as sensitive as some of the other usage of data. I think these principles can help create a privacy framework that balances the competing needs of innovation, commerce, privacy, and security, and provide a balanced way forward. Thank you.
Okay, so I believe I'm supposed to be a big talking head. Can you all hear me? Oh, okay, got it. Okay, I thought I was going to be a talking head behind you, but now I get it. Okay, hello, I'm Jane Bambauer. Thanks so much for tolerating my participation virtually. I'm a professor of law at the University of Arizona, where I study things like the tension between competition law and privacy. And so, like the other panelists said, there is a tension between these two goals, but the tension is itself complex. Both antitrust and privacy laws tend to be costly for the big dominant tech firms, which is kind of the point. And I think that's why politicians are sort of eager to go ahead and pile on both. But the problem is that they each tend to harm new entrants to the digital marketplace, but they do so in different ways. And I think that's where the complexity, or at least that's the sort of complexity that I want to use my few minutes to highlight. So, okay, one type of new entrant to the digital marketplace is the sort where the services that they provide really require having some data in order to get good performance. So they're really not going to be competitive unless they already have some decent data, maybe de-identified data, but in any case, data on the population that they can use to train machine learning, or can train their algorithms that customize content or advertising distribution or whatnot. So for these smaller firms to compete, they do need more data transfers and reuse opportunities. And they need these to not be sort of bogged down or made prohibitively costly through extremely technical consent requirements, and they also, would suffer from requirements under GDPR or U.S. privacy proposals that require sort of a full staff of privacy professionals and whatnot. And so we know we have a history of research coming out of Europe that shows that that indeed we see that small firms suffer when privacy requirements are amped up. So, for example, let me give just a few things that are well studied. So, after GDPR, websites across Europe dropped about 15% of their web technology vendors. Okay, well, that's kind of the point, right? That the idea is that when there's more privacy, you're going to use fewer vendors who are collecting this data. But the firms that were dropped were disproportionately the smaller firms. So the big firms like Google and Facebook that already had a lot of data were not dropped, or were not dropped as often. So that meant that more than one study have now found that there is an increase in market concentration for that kind of B2B service. Okay, another thing we know is that venture capital in Europe shrank after GDPR. Again, maybe that's kind of the purpose. We don't want money flowing into the types of industries, the types of business models that that violate fundamental human rights. Well, but one problem is that the venture capital shrank disproportionately for new entrants or for firms that were less than 5 years old. Didn't really affect the larger, more established firms. And then last example, I promise. After the previous era of European data privacy law, back when Europe was under the Data Protection Directive, there was good evidence that digital advertising spending fell overall. And again, okay, that's the point. That means that the privacy law is working. But again, it decreased in different ways for different websites. And this, I find this quite chilling and scary, that it disproportionately fell for websites that were creating content pitched to broad audiences, because they couldn't use the content on the website to pigeonhole their audience, and so therefore they were less attractive to digital advertisers. Whereas the website that pigeonholes its audience, you know exactly the ideology, or exactly the kind of income level of the typical reader, they were not as affected by European privacy law. Okay, so these are some, a combination of intended and unintended consequences. So I'm quite a fan of the mission of the Digital Markets Act in Europe, because it's trying to address this problem. So the idea is that, okay, well, we have these dominant firms that already have the data. Let's find a way to require them to provide data to potential competitors. As other panelists have already said, this does work at cross purposes to some extent with GDPR. And there really is this problem where the small firms are both the white knights, the firms that we hope will rise and give us services that Google and Facebook are like too big and kind of dominant to really have the incentive to create. We want these firms to be innovative. On the other hand, the class of smaller firms also contains the greatest violators of privacy norms. These are the fly-by-night firms as well. And so the Digital Markets Act might help alleviate some of the competition problems created by GDPR if we can get those two laws to work together. But they increase the chance that there's going to be a Cambridge Analytica problem, right? A small firm that is doing something that is not under sufficient kind of scrutiny of the larger firms that have to give it data. Okay. All right, so that's one type of firm entrant where I think the privacy law can get in the way of competition. The other type of new entrant, I'll do this very quickly, are services that are trying to create a new business model that's reliant on initially collecting lots of data. So, hold on a second. Okay. COVID time. Okay, so Google at one time was one of these types of entrants, right? That they were collecting lots of data to provide free services, and they were making use of that data. That was the sort of the form of rather than taking money, they took them. Tesla is trying to do that now, that they're trying to compete against other driverless car companies by collecting tons and tons of data. Well, if we have a law that's sort of not very thoughtful and that requires these companies to give data away for free, then there's not a lot of incentive to start these types of new firms initially. So then we might think, well, okay, we want the law to go ahead and require data transmission, but we need to like have the new entrant pay for it. It's really hard to set the price rate in advance as well. So I think these are just really difficult problems, like George and other panelists said. It's not true that there's a zero-sum trade-off between privacy and antitrust, but it is complicated. The last comment I want to give is that is the idea that that privacy is undermined for a pure kind of profit motive. There's pretty good evidence. I mean, that there's at least one study that that there is an inverse correlation between the privacy grades that an app gets in the Apple App Store or the Google Android App Store and the user reviews for the apps, and that's especially true again for the smaller companies. And so I tend to resist the assumption that if a firm is kind of exploiting data or violating privacy norms, that means they're only doing it to kind of make a cheap buck and to exploit the user. In fact, it may be what a small company needs to do in order to get the performance level high enough to actually compete. Thank you very much.
Okay, so just a few issues thrown out there for the discussion, right? So to start off the discussion, I thought we could start discussing the current framework, the current regulatory and legislative landscape, and do we think that the current enforcement mechanisms available to agencies like the FTC are a sufficient mechanism? And now, as we have individual states creating their own privacy laws, trying to preempt, anticipated federal laws, the impact for both small and large entities having to deal with up to 50 different state privacy laws, and then looking to our federal privacy law, the different components and different aspects of it, including private rights of action, is that going to be sufficient to kind of balance a lot of these, interests and balance that tension between the two? Or is there a better path forward that we can look at as we look to what privacy should be and how we balance competition at the same time? For anyone on the panel.
Well, maybe I'll jump in. So I think there's a lot of criticisms going around about the FTC. What have they done? I mean, so the FTC has its source of authority, unfair and deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce, and unfair methods of competition. And unfair methods of competition is antitrust authority, and it interprets that generally coterminous with the Sherman Act. So the FTC has, and the Clayton Act, it reviews mergers, it investigates conduct. So most of its activity has really been in the in the privacy space, in the unfair and deceptive acts or practices. The FTC actually used that very broad authority, which was given to it in 1938 by Congress, to, I think, really great effect in the early days of the internet. Congress, wasn't stepping in, and the FTC used its deception and unfairness tools it brought, an early online privacy case in 1999. We've got, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which Congress did step in to pass. But most of its activity has been this case-by-case enforcement. And so I think it used that to great effect, but it's kind of reached the limit of those tools. And it's time, I think, for Congress to step in and to give, you talk about all the different interests and factors. That is inherently a political process, right? That's what we have legislatures for, is to come to the kind of balancing that puts those, factors all into the mix and comes out with, the compromise that not everyone likes or most people don't like, because that's what a compromise is, but would give the FTC the tools to move forward. So I think that is really important. The FTC is considering doing privacy rulemaking right now, which it is calling commercial surveillance, which is kind of a newfangled term, I would say. And I do have some concerns about that. They've asked a lot of questions, 95 of them, so we don't know quite what it will look like. But the FTC still only has that unfair and deceptive acts or practices authority. So whatever a rule might look like, it's still going to be cabined by that core authority. The rulemaking doesn't give the FTC, a wider remit other than to implement something through a rule. And it's very unclear whether a rule would preempt all the different state laws that are online or being contemplated. So I don't think a rule, if it's the 52nd iteration of privacy, is going to give much, certainty and reduce the burdens on small business to comply with all of those things. So. So I do hope that Congress kind of steps forward. And I do want to mention a law that was an early privacy law that people don't really see as a privacy law, but it is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So we look back, and I actually have an article that looked at all the debates that were happening at the time. And a lot of the concerns that were being raised are very similar to the concerns that we hear today. People are there, we're testifying saying, there are these big databases and computers, and they're making decisions about me, and I don't know, what's in there and how to control it, and I don't have any insight into that. So Congress stepped forward and it created the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it specifically recognized that there are benefits to society, to commerce, from the use of this consumer data, very sensitive consumer data many times. And what it put on top of that to allow these benefits to happen are obligations, right, on the entities who compile this and use it. And consumers, if there's an adverse decision made about you, and they focused on important decisions, credit, employment, insurance, housing, things like that, not, did I get an ad for a golf club or did I get an ad for, a kayak or something like that. And then the companies have obligations to provide access to consumers, to correct data, to give consumers the notice that this adverse, they were getting an adverse decision based on this data. So that, I'm not saying that that's sufficient now, but I think that provides a really good framework for how we address this issue, which was very similar many years ago, and balance those interests, because it's really a huge benefit to society to be able to offer credit that is risk-based, right? Even if perhaps as an individual consumer, if you have a bad credit rating, you would prefer that data not be shared. And Congress specifically balanced those things. So anyway, just another pitch to say, I really hope that Congress can move forward with a federal law that, helps clear the way from all these different things that these different obligations that are conflicting, that may be hurting competition because they're making it so difficult for small players to navigate through that landscape.
I'll add just one thing to the aspect of your question: how do we move forward on privacy without it tripping over competition? And the antitrust enforcement agencies can play a very useful and constructive role there. They've been doing something for a long time that the commissioner is well aware of, called competition advocacy, where they look at proposed laws, proposed rulemakings in other agencies, what the states are doing, and will weigh in if they see things going in a direction that is going to unavoidably, needlessly, interfere with competition, and will say there's a better way to do what you're trying to do, try to do it this way instead of that way.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I used to be in charge of that program at the FTC when I was the head of policy planning.
And on enforcement mechanisms, I think it's unfair to criticize the FTC for how enforcement has gone, because the problem isn't the mechanism. The problem is that there's not a federal privacy law with specific rights and specific obligations on companies to enforce. So trying, as the Commissioner said, to shoehorn a lot of privacy enforcement into unfair and deceptive trade practices is a challenge. But if there's a new law that is more clear and easier to administer and enforce against, then the FTC would have that ability. And so I think it's not the mechanism. We need the substantive laws in place for them to enforce.
Ryan, Jane?
Yeah, I want to reiterate the importance of risk balancing, which I think the current proposed federal law does not do enough of. So I'm actually even a little puzzled by why the proposed federal law is considered to be a compromise. It looks to me like it's only a compromise in the sense that it definitely preempts state law, but in every other way, it's as strong and bold, and in some ways even creates new rights that go beyond GDPR and the CCPA. And so I think that's going to cause a lot of problems with competition. And so I also, I agree that we are at risk right now of creating an unmanageable patchwork of state laws. But I do think it's possible for Congress, or a state for that matter, to set what I call, I guess, a lower bar, something that is more of a balance between the needs of industry and the risks, the greatest risks that are likely to materialize for data users, so that it can be reconciled with higher standards. Any company that complies with GDPR automatically will comply with this type of law as well. And so we don't need to match the rights and the strength of the privacy requirements in order to reduce the patchwork problem.
And I think it's interesting, you're talking about the companies themselves who are having to, comply. Even American companies are bound by DMA, DSA, GDPR as they do any kind of business or have any users in EU or, how many other countries have similar privacy frameworks. And, is there any sort of self-regulation that these companies bring from that framework that has, a net positive here that maybe, I don't know, satiate some of the appetite for more aggressive concern? Not to say that we don't need federal legislation, but, are these companies on their own doing a lot of the things that we're looking for a statute to do? So the statute's a defense, but it's not necessarily, active concerns that we're seeing actually play out.
So, I think one of the problems there is that companies can do that, but and I'd say many in our industry do, because they're complying with GDPR everywhere, they're complying with CCPA everywhere. But it's without a federal law that establishes what all companies are going to do. There are always going to be players in the system that are misusing personal data. And so I think it's really important that even as companies self-regulate themselves, or because of complying with the law in one jurisdiction, apply it everywhere, we need all companies that are going to be using data in some way to make sure they're using it responsibly. And having a federal standard is what I think accomplishes that. Not for the benefit, it shouldn't be geared, one thing I disagree with is I don't think it should be geared towards what are the needs of industry. It should be what are the privacy expectations of individuals, and what obligations do we need to put on companies to make sure that those expectations are met. And in doing that, we'll set a level playing field for all industries, and we'll make sure that companies act responsibly across the board.
I think it's, Jonathan, I think it's interesting, you bring up the GDPR, the DMA and the DSA. I think perhaps there's a broader question too, because global privacy landscape is changing so rapidly, where does the US see itself with respect to, say, things going on in Asia Pacific, which also there's a new data privacy norm going on in some of those countries. There's of course the Chinese and the Russian model, and there's of course the European model. One advantage, ironically, that the US has and the UK has as well, I think, is that they're a bit of late comers. The US doesn't have a federal privacy privacy law. The UK has incorporated GDPR into English law, but right now with Brexit, there's a lot of things that could change potentially. So one thing that I have advocated is that kind of gives both countries an opportunity to have a third way forward. That's sort of that's different from the EU approach, and that's also different from the Chinese approach, in that it's better able to balance the competing needs of data privacy, business interests, security, and also innovation. And what that would look like, we can talk about it and discuss that further. But I think it's also important to think about the broader picture and sort of where the US sort of data privacy landscape fits into that, and how that also could be a model for other countries that are trying to craft their own data privacy law and approach to antitrust as well.
So I think it's really interesting how you talked about this third way forward, because historically the US has always liked to be the pioneer, the one kind first man on the moon, as we approach a lot of our policies. And as you mentioned, the US is actually behind on this. Other countries already have their policies in place. So, we're playing catch up here. So what kind of things can the US look at as kind of, how do we be that third way forward? What should that third way be? And how does it work in tandem with these existing frameworks without being, overly bound or restricted by them?
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I do just to sort of take a step back from that question. The U.S. has been the real leader in creating this whole digital environment, right? This whole digital economy. And I would prefer that we were first in that and innovation rather than being first in regulation, right? So I just want to say that's not a prize you necessarily want to win to say. But Europe has specifically said that now, right? They're going to lead in regulation. Well, I think it's been I'm not saying that we don't need changes and we don't need enforcement, we do, but that, what is the goal that we want there? I don't necessarily think it means to be, the first in regulation.
No,
Brian, sorry, just to add to that, and then I'll turn back to you. So I really appreciate you saying that, and I think that's a great way of putting it, because, without the US, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But if we are the leader, we want to ensure that we have a framework that fosters and promotes and supports innovation. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way.
I very much agree with what Maureen has said. I mean, I think the goal should not be to be the global regulator, but then don't produce any of the world's leading companies. I think the goal should really be innovation, and then really create a regulatory framework that enables that innovation to continue. I think in terms of that, there's of course a first mover advantage, right? In that you're the first person to create the law, then perhaps other countries follow it. But I think there's also very much of an advantage not to do anything in the beginning, because you can. I think my starting point with that would be, let's study all the different data privacy laws around the world and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and I think we can learn from the regulatory mistakes and avoid creating the same sort of regulatory burdens in the US. So I think the good thing is there's already a lot of data, so one doesn't have to make the same mistakes to learn from those and craft a business and consumer-friendly privacy framework.
Can I add to that? I completely agree. It reminds me of the Tin Hak Tan saying, "Don't just do something, stand there." We have an advantage from standing here for a little bit. But I think one of the problems with GDPR-style privacy law is that it moved from what the US had been developing since the early 20th century, which was a risk-based approach to privacy, a torts-based approach to privacy, into a property control style version of privacy, where the right to control your data is both over and under inclusive. So if you don't really know the downstream benefits, you might harm yourself as a consumer by opting out or not, participating. And at the same time, if you don't have enough information to know the downstream risks, then you're also likely to suffer despite the control that you, in theory, have over your data. And so I would really, I hope that we can go back to the sorts of principles that helped inform things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, that tried to define what types of information-based harms we really want to avoid, and to match user expectations, but match user expectations when those expectations are well informed, rather than matching user expectations from the standpoint of a user who is not, and doesn't know yet about how a new service is going to work and what they're going to do or how they're going to repurpose their data.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. So, I mean, it's one of the things that it's really nice to see that, even though we have different perspectives, we all kind of see the value of a proactive, forward-looking mechanism that, really does try and address those tensions. So, what is kind of the expectation that small entities should be looking towards? I mean, what's kind of, they're coming into this landscape where we're in uncharted territory. And kind of what best practices can they look towards when right now we're really unsure which direction we're going to end up with?
Well, one way to look at it is if the practices that you're engaging in with somebody's personal data were to show up on the front page of the New York Times, would you be embarrassed about it? because companies, regardless of their size, need to act responsibly with data and in line with the reasonable expectations of their customers. Now, that might include, as the professor was saying, some things that maybe the customer didn't know about how it would be used, and if they knew, they would be really happy with it. But it's really important that I think that the law both encourages and requires companies to be thinking about how do we act responsibly with that personal data. And from a privacy law perspective, we shouldn't be thinking about how does it encourage competition. I think from a competition perspective, we should. But when we think about privacy, it shouldn't be either punishing really big companies or trying to engage in things that aren't about how do we ensure that individual privacy is being protected. But within the privacy context, that goal should be front and center.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And, a lot of companies do try and brand themselves as, privacy is on the forefront of their business, and that, their competitive edge is that, that protection of privacy. But on the other hand, does it work the other way? Is there an inverse of that where, a company uses privacy for, a competitive benefit and vice versa? There is a tension, but is it also not a net benefit to one another to be able to utilize both? Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Maybe to make the panel interesting, I'm just going to really disagree that the New York Times front page should be our standard for knowing whether a company has engaged in a bad practice or not. It's much too easy to get to generate press that focuses on expectations that are breached, but without explaining what the ultimate impact on the consumer is. And there are just so many services that we're used to now, everything from every service Google provides to caller ID, even like the movie industry that started with some firms that actually either broke the law or at least broke the norms, and then had to show the consumers why it was worth it. And then at this point, consumers would not want it, any other way. And so I just think there's a real problem with dynamism if we ask today what consumers expect.
Anyone have a response to that?
I hope that when companies are collecting data, that they are thinking about what those individual consumers would want or not want to happen with their data. As the industry representative here, I feel awkward saying there should be regulation in order to make sure that consumer expectations are met, but I think that's important both in the company collecting the data and other companies that might use the data in the system. There are obviously tremendous uses for personal and non-personal data to improve services, to provide new services, but to use data in a way that is not anticipated by, or that would not be approved by the consumer, I think as a norm would be a problem.
And one thing I would add to that, kind of going back to how the FTC enforced for many years and continues to enforce, deception. Don't say one thing and do another. And the other is, are you using the data in a way that causes a substantial harm to consumers? that the consumer, hasn't consented to or isn't, aware of. And I think a lot of the concerns, particularly in the competition area, focus around data uses that are really for advertising, right? And so when we have surveys of consumers, they're worried about, well, there's going to be identity theft, or someone's going to stalk me, they're going to steal my money. They're much, much less concerned about, well, I'm going to get targeted ads. And in fact, they often like that. It's seen as a benefit. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes as kind of what's driving a lot of this and what consumer expectations and concerns really are. And I do think that that's something that we need to unpack a little bit more.
So maybe this is like a final question that we can then turn to the audience. So do you think there's like a disconnect between data privacy and, say, data security, where it's not so much about just your data and, as you said, you go on Instagram, you're getting ads for something you Googled or, mentioned to a friend a few days ago, compared to, my Netflix has been hacked and now they have my credit card, and, kind of going from there in the parade of horribles?
I mean, I think there is, and I think people often kind of conflate the two. I mean, the data privacy and data security, it helps if the information that companies have that they keep secure, but sometimes people conflate that also with anonymity, and sometimes data security actually requires having additional data about the customer to verify that it's that customer. But data privacy is far more than data breach. And I think we've kind of gotten beyond that initial idea that, it's just protecting from hackers. Data privacy is a much bigger topic.
That conflation of terms issue is a real problem, and partly it happens because in European parlance, it's data protection, right? And it includes both data privacy and data security. In the US, we generally talk about those two differently. We talk about it as data privacy and data security. But the nomenclature becomes important because there are some tensions between the ultimate policy aims of both of them.
I think that becomes especially important if you're considering encryption. Sort of, you can, on one hand, you can really make data transmission very private, but there's also the question of government access to data, and that too, in certain countries that have really been at tensions with one another.
And as you teed it up, looking at it from the other standpoint, I mean, sharing of data also has tremendous value. So how do we balance the value there of, the transmission and the sharing of that data and the benefit to, multiple stakeholders with that data sharing, with those privacy interests as well?
So I'll jump in there. I think that it should be encouraged. And I think that we've seen a number of companies that have put together templates for what data sharing agreements would look like in order to make sure that privacy is protected, the security of that data as it's being shared is protected. And I think those can have tremendous benefits as long as there's clarity around what's happening. I think there's a competition component there too. Sometimes companies don't want to share data because they're concerned about whether there would be an antitrust issue, and I think there's probably business letter review ways of trying to address that. But there are tremendous benefits around having open data among companies, as long as it's something that the companies want to do and it continues to protect the privacy of the individuals.
On the other hand, setting up a tiered system where a large platform says, we know we're protecting the data just fine as long as we keep it in-house, but if we share it, we're not so sure. So we're going to set up larger barriers, and we're going to screen out people who we think there are doubts about. That creates the tension with the access questions and competition. So that's going to be an important thing and an interesting thing to look at going forward.
Yeah, no, thank you all. Is there any audience questions? Damn, rough crowd.
My name is Amar Islam. I've been in this industry from last 10 years. And before that, I was a lawyer back home in Bangladesh. I started first documentation on IT in '96. I think everybody heard me, right? mic is always. And my recent question may be very small, but from the personal location, when I can give you an example, like everybody know when those people, those expertise have secret level of clearance, any sort of, if they want to put their profile in a, say, clearance job. So clearance job asks for whether you have a secret, what level of clearance, there's a drop-down comes up, they select it. If they have, then they are allowed to get in and then put their profile and their data and everything. But that very candidate get the call from offshore company, the recruiters. So here is a very big breach of data, personal data. So from a very low level, grassroots level, we need to think about to protect the data of the experts within the jurisdiction and how we can handle it.
I'm happy.
Feel free.
I think there are two things that can happen, and it's important to always be looking at both of them. One is that a company that collected the data may be doing something inappropriately with the data, and that's one set of issues, and we usually put that under data privacy. Another is that somebody else broke into the system, and that we usually put under data security, and there was a hack, and that's how data got out. And it's important, as we were talking about before, to be thinking about both the data privacy and the data security issues. Sometimes it's a company acting inappropriately, sometimes it's a bad actor from the outside.
You know, it actually brings to mind a case called HiQ versus LinkedIn, where there was a company called HiQ that was scraping data off of LinkedIn to create profiles about who might be in the market to move, and then notifying their employer that, hey, you may want to, be aware your prized employee might be leaving. And so LinkedIn sent a cease and desist letter that then HiQ challenged as an antitrust issue. And the initial decision by the court, which was interesting because it was in California, which we think of as, super, forward-leaning on privacy stuff, said, oh, no, this HiQ needs this data to compete, and it really did not weigh consumer privacy interests at all in that. Now, it has since moved on from there, but the initial decision was so interesting that you had judges saying, oh, privacy, schmivacy, the competition, they need this to be in the market, ergo, you can't enforce that cease and desist.
Hi, I'm Ashley Gum from AT&T, and I attend a lot of antitrust conferences, so this is kind of coming from that perspective. You don't have to attend a lot to hear one of two refrains. Antitrust cannot solve these privacy problems is one you hear a lot, and antitrust is a fact-specific practice, and enforcement is fact-specific. So with those kind of in mind and imagining maybe just one of those participants on a panel up here in that empty seat, I wonder if the panel has any thoughts about kind of extra legislative or extra at least antitrust legislative fixes. And I'm thinking here, the previous panel was somebody mentioned incentives, and then Professor Bombauer mentioned Tesla, and so I'm thinking, yes, they did gain a foothold in their industry, perhaps are gaining a foothold in the industry through data collection, but they also had the benefit of, I think it was $7,500 per vehicle tax break or refund or something like that. Are there other ways besides tinkering with ADPPA or antitrust legislation to kind of foster this, the good data practices, and at the same time, maybe improve competition? And I'll just throw out one other idea. I think it's Scott Galloway's, one of his chief things that he says is, you know, kind of more ex post, break up the companies. You've got to break up the companies first before you're going to see any competition among their constituent companies. Thanks.
I'm sorry to keep starting, but I think it's a good point, and you see some examples of it through like the Digital Markets Act in Europe, which is not an attempt to address privacy through add-ons, as you were saying, to competition laws, but it's using competition principles to say at a certain size, we're basically going to presume market dominance, and therefore there are some things that you're not allowed to do, some kinds of contractual terms you're not allowed to enter into. And similarly, I think with Senator Klobuchar's legislation here, it's the same kind of principle of, in some circumstances, we are going to assume that rather than have to go through a fact-specific analysis, we're going to assume that you have market power, and we're going to say there are certain practices at that point because you're effectively an essential facility that we're not going to allow. So I think that those discussions are starting not to get at privacy, but to get at an easier way to handle antitrust in this sector.
It short circuits or cuts through some of the proof requirements that are so challenging, you know, and require economic analysis in the typical rule of reason antitrust case to do what Aaron is talking about. On the breakup idea, that was one of the proposals that was bandied about in the House Judiciary Committee during their consideration of legislation to address big tech competition issues, and ultimately is not going forward now. As you coming from AT&T would know, there's only been one major breakup in the last 100 years under the Sherman Act, and it was your, I would say, former company, and because it's a much different company now. I think that's a pretty radical step. You know, they talk about, there's another phrase, unscrambling the eggs, how difficult it is to do that once they're scrambled. And there are sometimes ways to do it, but it can cause you know, unintended consequences. It can be very disruptive to a marketplace. And so the antitrust laws already allow that in an appropriately extreme circumstance when the violation is proven and the court decides there's no easier way to remedy the harm and keep it from recurring, you know, that it's embedded market power that is being abused and will be abused until there's no longer market power. You know, that's an issue that's being considered now in the antitrust agencies, but I think it needs to run its course.
I think we have time for like one more question, if there is one. In the back corner.
Hey, I'm Shannon, and I'm from Albright Stonebridge Group. So I just have a quick question here about, like you said, about the difference between data security and data privacy, like the nuanced differences here. Because normally when we are talking about data privacy, we think it is protecting the user's data. But like in the context of US, you say like they're different. So I was wondering, like, can you just elaborate on that, and also like what's its like business implications for business operations here? Yeah, thanks.
Well, one of the ways I look at the difference between data security and data privacy is often the data privacy issues are, not always, but often are surrounding the idea that as a consumer, I interacted with the company, they collected my data, and they used it in these certain ways, and maybe I didn't expect that, or maybe they shared it in a way, you know, that I didn't agree to if it's sensitive data. But it is the company that I had interacted with has that data, and what did they do with it? In my mind, data security is really more about, well, once they collect and they have that data, which, you know, they lawfully collected, how are they protecting that from unauthorized access, right? So we get data breaches, we get hackers, or sometimes there's internal risks too. So it is not based on, an interaction with a known entity. It's sort of stopping a hacker from getting in and using it. And I mean, sometimes it's a hacker, and sometimes it's just poor data security, and things are exposed on the internet, which then can lead to those things. So I know that in my mind, it's how I look at those two things. Now, as a company, if it collects that data, under the FTC view, there are obligations to secure it commensurate with its sensitivity. So there's an overlap there, but I think it's more of that unauthorized access issue in data security.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the panel. I hope everyone found it interesting. Thanks to the panelists for being so agreeable. I'm now going to turn over to Cam Carey to take over the next event.